Good afternoon and welcome to the September 2023 Mesa Planning and Zoning Board public hearing. We will begin with a roll call. I am Board Member Crockett. Chair Ayers is absent today, as is Vice Chair Pitcher. Board Member Peterson.
Here.
Board Member Montez.
Here.
Board Member Blakeman.
Here.
And Board Member Carpenter.
Here.
Well, it appears that we have a quorum, so we will move ahead. As you heard in the introduction, we operate with a consent agenda. We have a couple of items on our consent agenda today that will be voted as a group. If there's anyone that is here, just to confirm, on items 3C and 3D, and you'd like to speak on those, you need to let us know right now. Do we have any requests to speak? And I'm not seeing anyone in the audience. So Board Member Carpenter has volunteered to read our consent agenda today, so I will turn the time over to him.
Thank you. The items of the consent agenda are item 3C, PZ 23111, proposed amendments to chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 30, 31, 33, 86, and 87 of Title 11, zoning ordinance of the Mesa City Code. The amendments include, but are not limited to, modifying land use tables to remove outdated information and correct references, modifying landscape standards to be consistent across various chapters of the zoning ordinance, clarifying outdoor storage requirements, modifying how accessory structures are measured, clarifying development standards for group commercial, industrial, and office developments, correcting previous codification errors in the land use definitions, and adding a new definition for cross-access. The staff recommendation is adoption. The next item of the consent agenda is agenda item 3D, PZ 23112, proposed amendments to chapters 69 of Title 11, zoning ordinance of the Mesa City Code, pertaining to site plan review. The amendments include, but are not limited to, amending the site plan modification process set forth in section 11-69-7 of the Mesa zoning ordinance. Staff recommendation, adoption.
Thank you. Okay, you've heard the consent agenda. Do I have a motion to approve it?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, let's vote. Well, there's the vote. Looks like the vote is unanimous, 5 ayes, no noes. You have passed your consent agenda. I will turn the time over now to staff for presentations on the remaining items.
All right, Chair, board members, the first item off of consent is item 3A, and our planning director, Mary Kapowski Brown, will be making a presentation on proposed text amendments to our historic preservation ordinance.
To you, changes to the historic preservation ordinance, which are included in the Mesa zoning ordinance, and some of the changes that we're proposing. As a background, what we looked at in 1994, the Mesa zoning ordinance was modified to include historic preservation regulations. In 1997 and the early 2000s, they were updated. But what we're finding is that in some cases they're a little outdated, and we wanted to bring them up to current standards. In 2019, we received a grant to update the Mesa zoning ordinance and to develop design guidelines for our historic resources here in the city. The regulations are found currently in 4 different chapters of the Mesa zoning ordinance, chapters 23, 44, 66, and 74. There are also several historic preservation terms that are not defined, and they have been added to chapter 87. So there were 3 goals that we wanted to achieve in doing the changes to the zoning ordinance as it related to our historic resources. The first, again, was to consolidate them all into one section to make it easy for those who currently own a historic resource to be able to understand the requirements that they would have to apply to their properties. We wanted to clarify standards related to designated historic resources in the city And we wanted to define any of those terms related to historic preservation, which are not currently found in the code. As it relates to consolidating standards and ensuring consistency, Chapters 23, the Historic Preservation Overlay chapter, Chapter 44 as it relates to historic signs, were moved into Chapter 74 to consolidate all of the regulations related to historic preservation into one part of the code. We also looked to eliminate redundant and unnecessary provisions. In some cases, there were things within each of the different pieces that we were able to eliminate. We wanted to ensure consistent terminology, so we're using the same terms as it relates to all of our historic resources. We wanted to update our references within the Mesa zoning ordinance, and we wanted to make our public notice requirements for historic resources consistent to conform with the other portions of the Mesa zoning ordinance. As it related to clarifying standards, we expanded on the purpose of the historic preservation procedures. For historic preservation overlay districts, we wanted to clarify the application and review process, update eligibility requirements, and then better define the current overlay process. As it relates to the certificate of appropriateness, we wanted to clarify the relationship with the building permit and when a COA, or certificate of appropriateness, is required. As it related to demolition permits, there were two things we wanted to clarify: that within an approved overlay district, if you were denied a demolition permit, that it could be appealed, and if it was denied, that there was a 180-day delay in issuing any demo permit to give city staff, members of the Historic Preservation Board, and the applicant an opportunity to work together to develop a plan or agreement to see if there was some way to clarify and determine a path forward. We've also added and clarified in that section that if all of the parties agree, that time frame can be extended. Within a proposed overlay district for a period of 100 days, once that proposal is put before city council or is applied to at the city, there is a stay of demolition for 180 days on any buildings. And if that overlay is not approved by the city council within 180 days, then demo permits could be allowed if they are applied for. As it relates to historic signs, we wanted to clarify the application and review process. We wanted to identify eligibility criteria, define responsibilities as it relates to maintenance and repair, and provide a clear revocation process for historic signs if someone wanted to take it out of that designation. It's important to note that all of our historic preservation regulations really is about balancing the historic resources and their importance in the city and protecting them with the rights of the property owner. And in everything that we've done, we've really tried to make that balance. And then we've also looked at a clear appeals process. We've defined terms. One is missing from this slide, and I'll add that. So we've defined the terms for historic districts, historic landmarks, historic preservation overlay, historic signs, and the historic preservation officer. And the one that's not on your list is the state of disrepair. Thank you. Just to clarify what that means as it relates to the duty to maintain. Through this process, we've had some outreach. We had a study session with the Historic Preservation Board on August 1st of this year. We had a public meeting on August 24th, had approximately 60 residents show up for that study or for that public meeting. And then the Historic Preservation Board made a recommendation on September 5th, basically agreeing with all of staff's recommendations with 4 modifications. Staff has agreed to 3 of those modifications. The difference in the recommendation from the Historic Preservation Board has to do with that stay of demolition as it relates to existing historic districts. They are looking at a 1-year stay of demolition for existing historic districts. And then on the supplemental list, which we maintain a Mesa historic property list of all of our historic resources, and then the supplemental list identifies potential resources that are eligible for designation. They put a 1-year stay demolition, a 180-day stay of demolition on those. That is different than staff's recommendation. Staff's recommendation is to maintain the 180 days for both the existing and the proposed historic districts. Our next steps are to bring this to City Council study session on November 2nd for their information, to introduce the ordinance on November 6th, and to look for a final action on November 20th. We are still working with the Historic Preservation Board on the design guideline portion of this project. So that may be delayed if we decide to bring them both together, depending on what happens at the Historic Preservation Board in October, in a few weeks. With that, I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Director Kopasky-Brown. Just for my own clarification, so the requested modifications from the Historic Preservation Board, staff has agreed to 3 of the 4, is that right?
That is correct.
And are those reflected in the proposal that we're voting on tonight?
That is correct.
Okay. And then with regard to the 4th proposal on the 1-year stay out, that's the recommendation of staff is 6 months and not 1 year, correct?
180 days, that is correct.
180 days, okay, thank you. Are there other questions on this one? I don't think so, thank you. Is there any discussion? Do we have anyone from the public here to speak on this item?
Not on this item, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Is there any discussion among the board members on this before we take it on? Board Member Peterson, please.
Yeah, so just in consideration of the Historic Preservation Board's recommendation for the stay of demolition to be extended to a year versus the 180 days, and whereas in the study session, it was represented that this is only for full demolitions, that they're very rare anyway, and that during that, if there was to be a full demolition, that applicant would be needing to prepare plans or do something for what they were going to do in lieu of the property once in lieu of the existing site once it was demoed. I just felt compelled to stay in line with the Historic Preservation Board's recommendation rather than modified as recommended by staff.
Okay, thank you, Board Member Peterson. Any other discussion on this item? Is there a motion forthcoming?
I'll go ahead and make a motion to approve item 3A PZ 23110, amendments to chapters 23, 44, 66, 74, and 87 of Title 11 zoning ordinance of the Mesa City Code pertaining to historic preservation overlays, historic signs, the Historic Preservation Board, and the Historic District and historic landmark procedures. The amendments include, but are not limited to, repealing in its entirety Chapter 23, Historic and Landmark Overlay Districts, and replacing it with a new Chapter 23, Historic Preservation Overlay, repealing in its entirety Chapter 44, Historic Signs, and replacing it with a new Chapter 44, Historic Signs, modifying Section 11-66-4 pertaining to the Historic Preservation Board, repealing in its entirety Chapter 74, Historic District and Historic Landmark Procedures, and replacing it with a new Chapter 74, Historic Preservation Procedures, and adding new definitions for Historic District, Historic Landmark, Historic Preservation Overlay, Historic Preservation Officer, and Historic Sign. And the recommendation on that is to approve in line with the approval of items 1 through 4 of the Historic Preservation Board's recommendation that was approved.
Okay, so.
Did I read that? Do I need to add anything to that?
Chair, board members, for clarification, you're recommending adoption of the proposed text amendments with the changes proposed by the Historic Preservation Board, and those are items 1 through 4, excuse me, listed in the staff report.
Correct.
Thank
Okay,
you.
So that is the motion that is on the table. Is there a second to that motion?
I second.
Okay, then I will call for the vote on that. If you'd vote now. Okay, by your vote of 4 ayes and 1 no, you have passed item 3A as it was amended by Board Member Peterson.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Then back to staff for the next item.
Thank you, Chair Crockett. Our next item is item 3B, which are proposed amendments to chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, 31, 58, 86, and 87 of Title 11 as they pertain to drive-through facilities. And Assistant Director Rachel Nettles will make that presentation.
Okay, thank you, Chair, Board members. Okay, it's showing up. I wanted to make sure. All right, so I'm here tonight to discuss with you some proposed amendments to our drive-through regulations. I wanted to give you a quick recap of this project and where we've been. So this project was initiated early 2022 at the direction of City Council. It has been an ongoing process with many iterations. We've been doing extensive outreach with the public, and based on feedback both from council, yourselves, and the public, there have been various modifications to the recommended text amendments. So we are here before you today to show you our proposed recommendation to move forward to City Council. So during that process of the feedback that we received, we heard both from our development community and from residences. And the feedback that we heard from the development community was that the proposed amendments requiring a council use permit would be costly, timely, and arbitrary. There was a sentiment then and request that these goals could be accomplished through development standards instead of hard regulations on the number of drive-throughs located adjacent to one another, and through regulating it through processes. And the other common comment was that our proposed amendments were not in line with other jurisdictions, that they were relaxing regulations, and that we were increasing ours and making it harder to develop in Mesa. At the same time, we continue to hear from residents that council should be limiting the number of drive-throughs to address some concerns such as on-site congestion and to encourage more out-of-car shopping and vibrancy of our centers. That they have, their opinion that there are enough quick-serve restaurants within the city already, and that there really is a desire for higher quality development in Mesa. So based on some of that feedback and the set of public meetings that we had late in 2022 and early 2023, staff took a step back, and we did some extensive research of our surrounding jurisdictions to see where they are allowing drive-throughs, what their processes were, and what their development standards were. So through this research, we found that drive-through facilities are permitted in a significantly larger portion of Mesa than in our surrounding jurisdictions. And we also found that our proposed development standards were very much in line with the standards of other jurisdictions as well. So before we have a table that outlines some of that research that we conducted. The first two columns look at the land area as far as the zoning districts where drive-throughs are permitted by right and where they are permitted with a council use permit. And those were shown on the previous slide with those maps. As you can see in Mesa, currently 21.2% of our land area permits drive-throughs by right. Only 1% of our land area requires a council use permit. The closest neighboring jurisdiction to us would be Gilbert, but they are far less, with only 9.1% of their land where drive-throughs are permitted by right, and 0.5% of the land where a council use permit, or a conditional use permit, I should say, is required. We looked also at our existing drive-throughs in the city, so as opposed to the land area and where they could be developed, we looked specifically at where drive-throughs are now and how many we have per capita. So per 10,000 people in Mesa, we have 5.07 drive-throughs. In comparison, Chandler is slightly higher. They have a smaller land area, but for them, they have 6.55 drive-throughs per 10,000 residents. We also looked at this in relation to the overall land area. And in Mesa, per 100 acres, we have 2.14 drive-throughs per every 100 acres. So you can see that we really do have a quite difference from surrounding communities in the availability to develop drive-throughs in Mesa. So based on some of that research, we went forward and further refined our recommendations. This is a summary of the categories. So we made some adjustments to the definitions. We created a separate definition for drive-through facilities, pickup window facilities, and drive-up ATM facilities. Currently, our zoning regulation, it addresses all of them under drive-throughs. One thing that we heard from both stakeholders, city council, other board members was, and staff agrees, that there is a difference in the operations of some of these facilities and in impacts they create. So by creating these different definitions, we were able to tailor development standards specific to them as well as processes. The next set of amendments are proposed modifications to the process for some zoning districts. This is to better align with other jurisdictions, to better meet the intent of the zoning districts themselves and the general plan character area designations, and to increase public engagement opportunities. Another big change to these amendments is we are proposing that an on-site circulation and stacking study be provided for drive-through facilities. This is specific for drive-throughs and would not be required for pickup window facilities or drive-up ATM facilities. And lastly, there are a set of modifications to our development standards to address some of the impacts. And this was, based on the recommendation that we heard from stakeholders. Instead of keeping to the hard number to address some of the concentration and the impacts that we had originally had in previous versions, we went back and refined development standards instead to try to address those. So with the proposed amendments to definitions, as I mentioned, we created 3 different definitions, one for drive-through facilities, one for pickup window facilities, and one for drive-up ATM teller window facilities. The big difference between drive-up facilities and pickup window facilities is that pickup window facilities do not have menu boards or order placing boxes there. Patrons would be placing their orders beforehand, and they simply drive up to the window to receive their goods. When we look at our recommendations for land use districts and the processes, we are recommending that a CUP be required in the neighborhood commercial, which was formerly required a special use permit. And then we're recommending that a CUP be required in the planned employment park, light industrial district, general industrial district, and heavy industrial district, which currently requires a special use permit. When we looked at other jurisdictions, most jurisdictions do not allow drive-through facilities in their industrial districts. When we look at the intent of our industrial districts, it is to promote employment generating uses. And those districts are often correlated to our employment district character area, which once again is intended to promote a wide array of high quality jobs. So we feel that by requiring a CUP, it better meets the intent of those districts and preserving those for employment uses and economic development within the city. This would not ban them from industrial districts, but it would allow city council to look at these and to determine whether they are appropriate for those areas and to consider the impacts that they pose. With these proposed amendments, the city attorney's office is working on various options that we discussed in the study session as far as Proposition 207 waivers and what property owners could do to keep the rights to develop a drive-through if they currently own a property with one of these zoning districts where it is changing. So for the on-site circulation and stacking study, this is a proposed requirement, as I mentioned earlier, just for drive-through facilities, not for pickup window facilities or drive-up ATM teller windows. And with this, we are requesting an analysis of the site to determine whether the proposed stacking meets the operational requirements of the facilities. So with this, there would be a description of the operational characteristics, which include the business hours of operation, the methods by which the orders are placed, the peak demand hours, the time required to serve typical customers, and lastly, how noise and other operations will be mitigated to neighboring properties. So a lot of these operational conditions kind of feed into stacking and how long people are lined up in these lines. In addition, the second part of this study would be a description of the on-site traffic activity itself. So what are the arrival rates? What are the anticipated stacking requirements? A requirement to show an on-site circulation plan, which shows points of entries, shows the distance of the stacking lanes, shows the cross-access drive aisles, and what that anticipated pattern of circulation is on the site. And this, once again, is to help demonstrate that it will not be causing impacts that overflow into adjacent properties or onto our roadways. And the last part of that would be a description, a mitigation plan of how that backup would be addressed. So what are the measures to prevent any such overflow into surrounding properties or onto the streets? The next set of development standards has to do with our stacking requirements. Currently, we require 100 feet between drive-through windows and order placing boxes and 40 feet between an order placing box and the entry to a drive-through. So we're recommending that this remain. And we are proposing that there be additional standards specific to pickup windows and ATM teller windows. Since they do not have many ordering boards or order boxes, instead for pickup windows, it would be 100 feet stacking distance from the window itself to the entry of that pickup window lane. And for the drive-up ATM teller window, 40 feet distance from the teller ATM to the entry of the lane itself. In addition, we are proposing that for all of these facilities that there be a 50-foot separation between the drive-through lanes and a street access or cross-access drive aisle. This mimics the requirements we have in the code currently for a 50-foot separation from access to a street to a cross-access drive aisle and to parking spaces. This actually came as a result of Planning and Zoning Board's recommendation a year ago to address some of the concerns about cars that were overflowing into adjacent properties, like in group commercial developments. Finally, we have written into the amendments that these stacking requirements can be deviated from if through the on-site circulation and stacking study, they're able to demonstrate that what they are proposing is sufficient to meet the demands of the operations. For drive-through screening, currently our zoning ordinance says that drive-through lanes should not be located parallel to arterial roadways. But if there are circumstances due to physical constraints that they may be located adjacent to the roadway, but they would have to provide a 40-inch high screen wall. With our proposed modifications, we are creating a couple of different options here, but we are also recommending that additional landscaping be provided in addition to these screen walls. So with the first option, it would still be the 40-inch screen wall, but in this case, the requirement would be to provide 2 additional trees and 2 additional shrubs per 25 linear feet of street frontage. And for the second option, instead of providing a 40-inch screen wall, a integrated awning canopy or trellis system that would cover the drive-through lane could be provided, and in that case, the landscaping would be less, which just would be 1 additional tree and 2 additional shrubs per the 25 feet of street frontage. Staff is also recommending that there be inclusion of requirements for shade and a raised pedestrian path for employees when they are outside taking orders. This is very much a trend that we're seeing in other jurisdictions, as it's kind of a new operational characteristics of many of our facilities that have people out there taking orders as opposed to a speaker box. Staff is also recommending that there be a setback requirement from residential uses and properties. Early on in our process and recommendations, staff had recommended that that drive-throughs be restricted from the neighborhood commercial center. And this was due to feedback from residents and the concerns about noise and impacts that they were experiencing from drive-throughs adjacent to their homes. Through the process, we heard a lot of concern from our development community about that proposal. And along with a lot of these other proposed amendments, there was the desire that this be handled through development standards versus a hard restriction or requirement there. So instead, staff is proposing that there be a 100-foot setback from a residential use or zoning district to the drive-through lane or pickup lane. This is in line with Scottsdale, who requires 125 feet from their drive-through lanes to residential uses. In this case as well, we've received additional comment and feedback from stakeholders that they would like to see a way to deviate from this standard. And so we have included within our proposal that this standard could be modified if they provided a sound study that showed that impacts could be mitigated in other ways. So we have heard some additional comments and questions, especially at our latest public outreach meeting that we had on September 6th, and I wanted to respond to some of those. One of them had to do with the on-site circulation and stacking study. Originally, we had a proposal that a traffic impact study be required. We heard from some stakeholders that they felt that this was onerous. We moved back a little bit and we evaluated that, and we felt as staff that some of these concerns could be addressed through a less intensive traffic study. But we do still have concerns from residents that they don't think that that is sufficient to address the concerns and the impacts on our roadways, and especially the cumulative impacts. And so we have modified the requirements within that section a little bit to include that cumulative impacts within 1,200 feet of the site would also need to be considered in that evaluation. As I discussed earlier, we heard the request that the 100-foot setback from residential to be modified through a study or a different provision, and so we did include that recommendation in with our text amendments that they could be modified by the planning director if shown through the sound study that it could be mitigated properly. Another comment was the desire for these amendments specifically in this chapter to allow for deviations to development standards. Staff is not including that recommendation in these text amendments, and that is because our zoning ordinance contains processes which outline various ways that development standards can be deviated. So it was not necessary to provide it directly in this chapter. We have lots of sections within Chapter 31 that address specific uses, and when any one of those uses or development standards can qualify for one of those other processes. So it's not needed to address individually in this chapter. Another comment that we heard was that existing pad sites right now would not be able to develop under the current proposed standards. So as I was just mentioning, we have several processes in place that were created to alleviate some of those hardships and to allow for infill and redevelopment. Those include the substantial conformance improvement permit, and that is specifically for developed parcels that are non-conforming. It allows them to expand without having to bring the full site into conformance. We also have a development incentive permit, and this is for bypass parcels, and oftentimes they're smaller and have a hard time meeting development standards. So this allows for modifications to those development standards to incentivize them to develop. And then finally, we have a planned area development and a bonus intensity zone overlay, which allows for modifications to development standards for creative solutions or innovative solutions that would accomplish the intent through other means. We heard comments from the public as well, or concerns from the public, that the proposed amendments would make existing facilities in the city non-conforming and unable to develop if they are burned down. The zoning ordinance In Chapter 36 addresses non-conforming sites, buildings, and uses, and this is already a consideration that is addressed in that chapter. If a site were to be damaged or burned down, they would have the ability to build back to their current standards as they are now. And lastly, we had the question come from council about how many more council use permits would they be seeing going to them for approval if these amendments were passed. So what staff did is we went back, and there's a typo on the slide, so I apologize. We looked at all of our applications from 2021 to January 2021 to June of 2023. And there were a total of 71 applications that involved drive-through facilities. 12 of those projects went to city council already because of either previous conditions of approval or because they were requesting modifications. And we only found that 5 additional projects would have had to go to city council due to the changes to the CUP requirements. So these draft text amendments are currently posted online for public review. We will be going to city council on September 28th for a study session. And then it is going to be introduced on October 2nd, and city council will be taking action on October 16th. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you for that presentation. Are there questions for Assistant Director Nettles on this item? I know we had a lengthy discussion in our study session. Is there anything else at this time? No? Okay. Thank you. Then I'll go ahead and open the public hearing on this, and it looks like we've got a couple of more blue cards. More than a couple. Okay, so let's go ahead, and I'm going to call you up, and when you come up, I'll have you state your name and your address for the record, and then you'll have 3 minutes to tell us what you'd like to hear. And let's see, let's start with Paul Gilbert. Let's start with you. And welcome back to Mesa.
Well, thank you. It's a delight to be here. My name is Paul Gilbert. My address is 701 North 44th Street, Phoenix, Arizona. You caught me a little by surprise. I was just kind of nodding back there. Figured I'd be a little later on the agenda. I'd like to preface my 3 minutes very quickly, because that's a short period of time, by saying I'd like to compliment the staff. They've done some things right in this report. Noted would be focusing on the new restrictions on design standards rather than the use, eliminating numerical limits for drive-throughs. That was a big change, and we're very happy to see that. Eliminating the requirement for a CUP in the LC commercial district. I like the idea of protecting employees that pick up orders. I don't know of any jurisdiction that does that, and I think it's phenomenal. So those are good things, very salutary. We're in support of those things. However, there are a couple of things we would like to discuss with you. We're very concerned about the requirements for the industrial district. Right now, you've got PEP, LI, GI, HI. You are now requiring a CUP where none existed before. This is plain and simple overkill. Other cities take a much more tailored approach, and indeed many cities in the valley, and I submit the majority of them, and I appear in all of them, don't have any requirement of this type whatsoever. I have a suggestion. I think if you're going to require a CUP, it should only be required in industrial districts that are adjacent to residential zones or uses. You are now requiring a queuing study for every drive-through in all districts where none was required before. Again, I submit this is not necessary and only required in certain instances. Why, in Chandler and Scottsdale, They only do it in required instances. Suggestion. Again, this may sound a little bit repetitive, but I submit that we ought to have this requirement for a queuing study only when the retail center is part of a retail center or a rezoning case. You are now requiring enhanced screening for every drive-through in all districts where only 40-foot or 40-inch screen walls were required before. Suggestion. Only require the enhanced screening if the proposed drive-through would be adjacent to a residential district. Common theme, but I think it has a lot of applicability here. You are now proposing a setback, automatic setback of 100 feet from any residential zone or use. We don't think that's necessary. It's not required in Chandler or Gilbert. One jurisdiction has it 125, but that is an anomaly, I'll submit. This doesn't find place in very many other jurisdictions throughout the valley, including most of your neighbors. No CUP should be required, we submit, when a process requires a major site plan review. If you're going through a major site plan review, the city has all the tools they need to regulate a drive-through. And you don't need to get a CUP. You don't need to do a queuing study. You don't need to do all these things. If it's a major site plan amendment, in order to satisfy the city, you've got to go through these strict site plan, major site plan requirements. This is redundant and overkill and not necessary. Now, lastly, and I know I'm just a bit over the 3 minutes, but it's pretty good for me. I don't think this case is ready to go to council, candidly. I've attended most of these meetings, and if I haven't been here, my staff has. So we've heard everything. I think we've read everything that's been passed out. We're hearing new things tonight for the very first time. And we haven't had a chance to digest them, although the outreach has been good. I'm not complaining, but changes continue to be made. The other thing that bothers me a little bit is that every time we reach something that's kind of an impasse or it doesn't seem quite right, we get this feedback. Oh, well, that's okay. We'll work with you on that. Well, this reminds me of one of my favorite scriptures when it talks about in Egypt there arose a Pharaoh who knows not Joseph. If we had Director Kopesky Brown to work with on all these cases, I might feel better about it. But who knows who's going to be there? Who knows what we're going to be working with? Who knows what those standards will be? So I submit that those things still have yet to be worked out in the ordinance and that this could use some more breathing room. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Gilbert. And let's have Mary Grace McNear come up next.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mary Grace McNear, and my business address is also 701 North 44th Street. So I will echo some of Paul's comments, but actually I'm going to cover something different. I wanted to talk a little bit about the queuing and circulation study. I appreciated the discussion downstairs in study session. It was very helpful that the board seems to be keying on some factors that will really be important to our clients when they try to develop property in Mesa. From the standpoint of a developer, sometimes we don't know who the end user is going to be. So if I'm going to fill out a queuing study, how accurate is that going to be before I have my users set up for my site plan? And I assume that this queuing study is going to be required at site plan review. See, it doesn't say that in the ordinance draft, but I think we're all assuming that that's where it will be required. So this is an example of some things that I just think the ordinance needs a lot more tightening, and this queuing study is still a concern to us because when I came here tonight, I was ready to say, before I sat through the study session, I was ready to say, how could it be that we're going to do a sound study for every drive-through in the city of Mesa. As it turns out, a sound study is only going to be required if you are trying to lessen the requirements. That's not what the ordinance says. So I would say, it needs some adjustment, and it needs some adjustment and then feedback from the community before, you make the changes that we were talking about today. We don't like the language, to be honest, that allows the planning director to require additional information in a queuing study at his or her discretion. Again, it's not that we don't like staff or we don't like to work with them, but what we see there is an opportunity for us to come into an unknown situation. Tell us what the rules are and we'll follow them. But don't leave a bunch of discretionary decisions out there to be made by staff, because that makes things uncertain. That slows things down and it costs us money. And it's unnecessary. I mean, if there was a good reason for it, I would say great. But, the necessity of it has not been shown. What if the information that we give you in a queuing study changes? A user changes and all of a sudden our hours of operation are different, or it takes more time, the time that we estimated to take orders or to fill orders. Are we out of compliance? What happens to our zoning if we're not in compliance in that way? Do we have to submit another study, or do we have to update the city in some way? None of this is covered in the ordinance. And again, it's concerning that we might come in and hear, oh yeah, well, if that does change, we want you to come back. We want you to report to us. I mean, maybe that's not in the offing, but we didn't know that we weren't required to submit a sound study in every case until tonight either. So again, this needs some adjustment and is not easy to apply whenever you come in to seek these approvals. Paul already said we object to having to get a CUP in the industrial zones. In the study session, we heard that staff and the council wants to preserve employment uses, and I heard that when I listened to the study session of council too. But it really these drive-through uses only take up a small portion of the industrial site. And what do they have, if they're on an industrial site, what do they have to be buffered from? Other commercial and industrial uses? I don't think so. This is an unnecessary obstacle. And I want to point out that in Chandler, a CUP is required in planned industrial and general industrial, and in Scottsdale, in light industrial and industrial park, and in Gilbert, not required in any industrial district, only in neighborhood commercial and Heritage Village. So I think we have a couple facts wrong there. Finally, well, I'm not going to repeat this. If you're going to build in some flexibility for us on these options, please put it in the code so that we don't have to rely on comments like this made tonight and we're not left hanging out to dry when it comes to get our approvals. Thank you so much. I add my gratefulness to the staff, my gratitude for the work that they did. I've been involved in this process since the beginning, and I really appreciate some of the changes that were made. Thank you.
Ms. McNair, thank you. Alan Tom, let's have you next.
Hello, Honorable Board. My name is Alan Tom. My P.O. Box is 31465, Mesa, Arizona 85275. I live near Power Road, Maine. I've been one of the residents here in Mesa for a long time, and we're being strangled to death here. We have my prime piece of property in the northwest corner of Ellsworth Road University, board members, and respectfully the staff here and the city attorney. My neighbor across the street is going to put a Wendy's, Taco Bell, and Dutch Brothers there across the street, and we have almost the same identical sign we've had for 60 years. I played by the rules. I got my zoning in place. Why am I being strangled with the possibility of this 100-foot setback? I did nothing wrong. Paid property taxes there, and I want to get 3 fast foods on my property there on the northwest corner of Ellsworth University. You know what kind of property that is, a very unique piece of property. To the east there, we got the freeway, west to east. There's a Circle K there. North, that's my problem. They just built a new residential development, several millions of dollars there. There's a new concept of building a small miniature home and renting them out. There's 160 of them built over there. Now, I got my property, my depth is 330 feet on Ellsworth and 600 University. You guys are all very intelligent there. I think go by 100-foot setback. I want to put 3 fast food restaurants there. Suppose Raising Cane wants to go there, In-N-Out Burger, Chick-fil-A. They're going to have a stack up lane. Instead of having 3, I might only have 1 restaurant or 2. Why am I being punished for this? I've done nothing wrong. There are so many things to be said. It's unbelievable. I don't have enough time. You know, how come these things are not sending out all property owners there that are going to do this type of thing? Here, about 8, 9, 10 years ago, I had the right to put another convenience store in my corner. The city of Mesa took that away from me. I didn't even know about that. You know, I'm grandfathered in, and I have 2 really smart kids that are government lawyers. One's a head county attorney out of state, and another one here just won an Arizona Supreme Court decision, precedent case. She's very sharp. I brought this up to her. She said, Dad, any legal zoning usage you have, he said, if regulations are so tough, you cannot develop for that over there. He said, that's a taking under the 5th and 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. And she's a very smart young lady. And my point is I'm emotional about this thing because I've done everything right. We paid our taxes. Why am I being punished? The northeast corner of Power Road and Main Street, I have 2 1/3 acres, and we own that for 65 years, our family. And I want to put eventually one of these days, maybe 2 fast foods, at least 1 fast food in the corner. We got a mobile home park over there. That's a residential property. Now, if I have 100 feet setback, maybe I can't get the stack-up light. I thought the 100 feet setback was to the driveway window. No, it's the stack-up light, however that may go 600, 700 feet. I mean, this is strangling me. In our country here, we're strangled with rules, regulations. We can't even breathe. You know, also, Mesa wants to be friendly for businesses? How can this be friendly for business over here? They come here with uncertainty. They allow to go to another city instead. This is really insanity. I'm pleading and begging you guys not even consider us over here. The old regulations are bad enough. You got the design review board, they address all these situations already. It's like what these people over here said. We're being strangled. I could sit here for hours and talk about it. I'm sorry about these gestures I made in the back, shaking my head and all this, but this is really, I just can't believe it. And again, is my family paid by the rules. I got my zoning in place, and the time is now. Like University in Ellsworth over there, that Northwest corner, why can't I get 3 fast foods over there like my neighbor's going to get over there right now? And you folks have seen their plan over there. And like I said, I'm being emotional. My wife told me not to get me emotional, but how can you be not emotional, you know? And I talked enough. And all I can say is this is, please put on your thinking cap. This cannot happen there. We're already being strangled to death already, you know. And now you're talking about the queue, stack-up lanes, and noise, and decibels, and all this. How crazy can that get, you know? People that they don't want to be in my near property, especially vacant commercial property, with the possibility of fast foods going, why don't you get a home further away, you know, or something like that? Why is always a handful of people running this country over here, you know? And so I think if you took a random scientific sampling of property owners and made 1,000 people there, I think you get a better view. I think people want more selection than fast foods there. That's the new culture today. Sure, it's all idealistic there. People more go to sit down in a restaurant, but it's not going to happen because there's no demand for it, you know. But again, I talk too much, and I'll shut my mouth up. And thank you for hearing me, okay? Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mr. Tom. It's
Yeah,
always good to see you here
thank
at
you,
our
sir.
meetings. You're
I
welcome.
know the difficulty you're going through, and I appreciate the staff and respect them, but I just want people to see my point of view.
Well, thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Okay, Jeff Welker.
My name is Jeff Welker, and I live at 3125 East Dover Street, Mesa. And as I anticipated, Paul, Mary Beth, and Mr. Toms have stolen all my thunder and left me with little to talk about. But I want to add my voice to theirs and thank staff for the hard work they've put forward on a very difficult task the City Council handed them. Not easy. In a former life, I used to make presentations in the study session chambers below and up here to the City Council when I was an employee for the City of Mesa. I was trained by a really knowledgeable manager, and he said, when you're making your presentations to boards or to the City Council, you can gauge how well you're doing with an ordinance amendment or a new ordinance based upon how many questions come at you and how long it takes to help those board members or council members understand what you're presenting to them. You spent, I'm going to guess, a little over an hour earlier this afternoon down in the chambers, bouncing questions back and forth off of staff. In some cases, the same question multiple times. An example being, why do we need to study queuing and stacking and provide those detailed and expensive reports if we comply with the standards that are established in the ordinance? A fair question. It was asked numerous times by these board members, and I think this board is a thoughtful board and asks thoughtful questions. But an example, and others have cited other examples of the ambiguities that are in the current version of the ordinance being proposed, the amendments. And I agree with Paul that I don't think this is ready for City Council prime time. And instead, I think staff should go back and try to address these ambiguities. I appreciate, for example, the explanation on what happens with the existing sites where most of the shopping center has been built, but maybe there's a pad or two that has been left for years and years and was developed under much different standards than today. How does that work? And staff points out various things within the current ordinance and other sections that could be used to help mitigate those issues. And they're correct, they exist, but I think the ambiguity is how they're applied with these new amendments, how would they work with them? Because I can guarantee you that that would be left to interpretation by applicants, landowners, staff, council members, and boards. And I think that the ordinance would benefit from greater guidance and more specificity on how these unique scenarios work. I also think it would be helpful and promote adherence if you say, if you adhere to standards, you don't have to use and provide this study. And if you need to deviate from the standards, then the study would be an obvious way to present data to staff to consider as to why your deviation might be helpful. I appreciate the board listening to our comments and hearing our concerns. The folks I get to work with own existing shopping centers, and the retail and commercial world is much different than it used to be, where we used to have large grocery stores anchoring these sites. Now they're anchored by AutoZone. And these parcels and the drive-throughs that are proposed are, in some cases, one of the very few things that help keep those centers alive financially. And when the city, with good intentions, creates more onerous demands and greater cost and time on these centers, they jeopardize their long-term viability. And so we would ask that staff be tasked with taking those things back, working on them, and coming back and making those changes and sharing them with you to show where they've addressed those items. And I thank you for that time.
Thank you, Mr. Welker. Okay, the last blue card I have is Carol Harder. She is opposed to this item. It's marked that she does not wish to speak. Is Carol here? Is this true? You don't wish to speak?
I have one comment.
Well, please come up to the microphone. I knew if I gave you a chance, you'd want to come up and take the mic, so. And you just state your name for the record and your address.
Carol Harder, 1515 East Bethany Home Road, Phoenix, Arizona, 85016. I guess I'm a pretty straight shooter. I think I'm going to address the elephant in the room, and that is that when this started out, there was this perception that by following some of this, that more sit-down restaurants or more restaurants with patios, with things that I think almost any of us, if we were asked, what would you rather have on the corner close to your home that you could ride your bike to? I want a true food, right? I want a place where I can go with my children, be out on a patio. I can tell you we own 5 shopping centers in Mesa. None of those users are knocking on our door. And so the perception that by doing this means that we're going to get more of those users, that we don't see that. I haven't seen that in probably at least 4 years now since COVID happened. So it's just going to make it so that the pads are going to sit vacant, which is the last thing that anybody wants. And we as developers are we would love the ability to have even more discussion with staff on addressing those concerns. And is there a middle ground? Is there a way to get to something that is more of what the residents want? And I think one of the challenges is going to be, if you look around at the sit-down restaurants in Mesa, especially in central Mesa, right? Country Club in southern Mesa and southern Maine and Lindsay, the people aren't, if you look at the sit-down restaurants, the residents aren't going there. They're going to the drive-thrus. And so this is not going to help to get to that. I think there's other ways to do that. That's it. Thank you very much for everybody's time.
Thank you for your comments. Appreciate it. Okay, do we have anyone online? And we don't have any more cards or any more speakers? Okay, then I will close the public comment portion of the hearing today. Let me just turn to staff and see if there's any response to any of the public comment that you'd like to make.
Yeah, board members, I would like to go back that this has been a very long process, and we have tried to take in consideration all of the feedback and different opinions that we've heard from the various stakeholders. Tonight, we're hearing from, a one set of those stakeholders, and it's unfortunate that we're not hearing the other voices. But it is our responsibility as staff to kind of represent those as well. And we are in a spot where we're trying to balance the needs of both of these parties. We've done our best to come to a reasonable compromise to accomplish those. No zoning ordinance is going to be perfect. We still continue to hear kind of conflicting consensus from stakeholders about wanting, more definition and restriction and, details about what there is, and then more flexibility. We've tried to put in processes in place that allows some flexibility and deviations. We've really been intentional about looking at our zoning districts and where those are allowed. We've heard a lot of feedback from our economic development community and different council members and concerns about, the amount of drive-throughs that are eating up our industrial and employment areas within the city. We think that through the council use permit that still provides opportunities for those, but it provides a good check and ability for the community to really assess what's best for the city. I think that's all I have to say for now, yeah. But Mary, maybe wanna.
Thank you, Rachel. Chair, board members, I think there's only a couple of things I would add. We heard a lot about the protection of residential districts, and yes, that is one part of this. So the design standards we have come up with really have a couple of goals. It is to protect those residential properties that are adjacent to these uses, but it's also about the image of the city of the city of Mesa. That will eventually leave me. I know it will. Sorry about that. It's about the image that we have here at the city. The drive-throughs. We hear over and over again, there are 4 or 5 drive-throughs in a row. What does that do to our major corridors where people are driving regularly? What is the image of our city with that? What we've done in listening to our stakeholders is there really is a lot of compromise in this as it relates to those design standards that we've put in place to try to make our public realm more attractive. It's not just about the adjacent residential uses, it's about what we see every day as we're driving down our streets. I think that saying that this is not ready to go to council is a little troubling, and that they're hearing new things today because we've not introduced anything that we haven't talked about, that was not presented at the public meeting that we had earlier this month. Everything we've talked about was in there. We've done some modifications to them, but everything was in the ordinance that was discussed at that public meeting. As it relates to the queuing study, we have a lot of residents who are asking for more as it relates to those queuing studies. They want full traffic impact studies. They want a full study where we look at the cumulative impacts as you would with any traffic impact study. What we've done in listening to the industry is said, look, what is the compromise? The compromise is we want to make sure that it's safe for cars. We want to make sure it's safe for pedestrians. We want them to show us how they're going to do that. We're putting that onus on the development community, the developer who's coming in and doing those drive-throughs, to say how they're going to protect the people that are going to be in that shopping area, to ensure that cars aren't queuing onto a street, rather than putting that onus onto the city staff once it happens to fix it. So what we're trying to do is get ahead of it before it occurs. As it relates to the noise, again, we're trying to protect people's quality of life. What we're saying is, if there is noise being generated by your use, you need to mitigate it, and you need to show us how you're mitigating it, again, to protect those residences that are surrounding those properties. There are so many processes already built into the code with very clear criteria and standards on what process would apply to any individual situation on a parcel, whether it's a PAD based on your lot size, whether it's a BIZ because of your lot size, whether you need to go through the skip process. There are so many processes already in place. To put those just related to drive-throughs really is counterintuitive to how a zoning code works, and that is your processes are set up to go through and put all of the different things that you're doing in your zoning code through the same processes, rather than all of these exceptions of you only need a CUP if you're in an industrial area adjacent to a residential property. It defeats the purpose of having that transparent equity for everyone to go through those same processes. And that really is how a zoning code should be written, to ensure that people are having very consistent, transparent processes that they're going through. I do want to just again point out with the industrial lands, a lot of our industrial lands where right now drive-throughs are permitted, that is where we're seeing a lot of our drive-throughs. And our industrial land is getting eaten up by those drive-throughs. So what we're trying to do is say, yes, they should be there. They should be allowed with a CUP so that people who work in that area have a place to go to lunch. But we do need to protect our industrial lands. We do need to protect those job opportunities. That's why they're being proposed for the CUP. We looked at all the surrounding jurisdictions to see that we are meeting the same kind of practices. We're not doing anything out of the ordinary with these recommendations. I don't think any of what we're trying to do is to say we're going to get more sit-down restaurants. That economic development is working on with City Council based on some direction for a study that they're working on. This is about the image of our city. This is about what you see when you drive down Power Road, or you drive down Broadway, or you drive down Main Street. This is about people who live adjacent to these areas to make sure that their quality of life is as protected as mine is and as protected as yours is. That's what this project is about. It's not about trying to encourage more sit-down restaurants. I think that's all I have left. Oh, Charlotte wants to add something.
Chair and board members, I just wanted to address some of the comments that were made this evening about the proposed text amendments requiring a council use permit when one is not currently required. As discussed in the study session, there is a process in the ordinance for a waiver where property owner can request a waiver to the changes in the proposed text amendments that would require that council use permit. And that would basically put the property owner in the same position that they exist today. And the timing and who can request the waiver and the waiver requirements and the specific information that they have to submit is all set forth in the ordinance.
Okay. Thank you for that. And if I could just follow up, Director Kropaski-Brown, on a couple of things you said. You talked about residents being concerned about seeing 3 or 4 drive-throughs in a row. Two questions on that. Is one of the purposes of this ordinance to reduce the number, or to limit going forward the number of new drive-throughs? And then secondly, is that the effect that this will have, this ordinance will be to reduce the number of new drive-throughs?
Chair Crockett, that's a great question, and the answer is no. This is not to limit the number of drive-throughs in a row. I think that was one of the original proposals. Based on the last 2-year process that we've gone through, that's been eliminated. So now the purpose of this is to ensure that the aesthetics, when a drive-through does go through, that it just has a better appearance from the arterial. There is no intent to try to limit that number.
And Chair, if I could add on to that, when this project first came forward from council, one of the concerns was about the impacts and the accumulation of multiple drive-throughs adjacent to one another. And to try to address that, early iterations did try to put numbers on the number of drive-throughs located adjacent to one another. Listening to stakeholders, we went back and decided to try to address those through development standards as best we can. And also this goes back to the concept of the on-site queuing and circulation study. It was suggested that we do a traffic impact study instead of putting a limit on those. So that was brought forward. And then that was asked not to be a traffic impact study, and so we tried to make modifications to that. So it's not about limiting the number of drive-throughs, but it's about addressing the impacts that they have. And those impacts do increase when we have multiple ones adjacent to each other. So how, as staff, how can we evaluate those impacts without receiving information about, what the operations are going to do and how those affect our streets?
Yeah, thank you for that explanation. And then just to follow up one more, and this may be a question, I don't know if Charlotte wants to weigh in on this, but we talked about a decimal limitation and in our study session, and Director Kapowski-Brown, you indicated that might be a good idea to include. How does that happen going forward? We've got a proposal in front of us tonight. If we approve that proposal, are there additional changes that would be made between now and the time it gets presented to the city council?
Chair, board members, if you want to make some amendments to what is being proposed this evening, you can do that when you make your motion, and you would just include that with your motion. You would say if you wanted to adopt it, then you would say adoption with, and whatever proposed changes you want added.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, well, are there other questions for either our director or assistant director? All right, are you ready to have a discussion on this item? Is there thoughts or discussions on this? Let's start with Member Blakeman.
I'm happy to go first. I'll try to be short. So I certainly understand that this is a very complex topic here. And I can see some of the things that I do like within it. I understand that we want to work on aesthetics. I couldn't agree more. Sound and being sensitive to the residences. I couldn't agree more. I also, reading through some of the support letters, really desiring more sit-down restaurants. I couldn't agree more as a resident. The one thing, so as I go through all of these things, and I have a few points I would kind of like to walk through. The first and foremost thing, when developers are suggesting certain developments be put in place, it is because there is a lot of market research that go on behind the scenes that they're willing to spend millions of dollars walking through a process and to build a building and invest in this. That said, although we're hearing from a lot of residents here that, they want less drive-throughs, we're seeing however many pages that we've got here. The fact that drive-throughs is what developers are proposing, it's because there's a market value, meaning there are residents here in Mesa using it so that it's profitable and it actually pencils out. So although we're hearing from a certain amount of residents, we're not hearing from all the residents. The residents are saying their votes through the fact that there's market demand. Does that make sense? So to me, what I see is the fact that there's 2, 3, 4, whatever that's being desired. I'm not just seeing that here in Mesa, but I'm seeing that anywhere across the valley. COVID has changed things, patterns have changed, and then you guys have also said you've gone through a 2-year process. That says human behavior changes even within that process. We start to move what Fiesta Mall used to be a thriving district, the place to be, and now it's getting torn down. So there's certainly a movement, and I think that, I know for a fact that the development community's responsibility is to know where the market's moving, and they move where money is moving, which means you're spending dollars. Residents are spending dollars there. So that's one, is that I think that I definitely want to allow developers to present what the market is starting to demand and ask for. And I think that's what you hear when you see site plans developed. If not, money wouldn't be spent on that. So number two, when we went through some of this stuff, they're desiring high. I read through a lot of the comments that residents submitted on both ends. First of all, I saw a lot of the support letters. They're wanting a lot of sit down, and this, as we just explained here, that's not achieving that. I think that this whole thing is not helping focus on that, and there's a whole nother effort that needs to go behind whatever we're doing economic development to attract and create the environment that will attract folks, sit-down restaurants to want to develop here in Mesa. And that's obviously not being accomplished for many reasons. So I don't know that it's addressing that resident concern for that. So also when I'm looking at the letters and I look at the ones that are in opposition, a lot of the opposition letters are from 2022. And as you read through the letters, they're actually not addressing what the current state of the proposal is, or what's before us. They're addressing things like the number of drive-throughs. So I know it's gone through some iterations. So what I believe what that says is there hasn't been enough time for the opposition to catch up to what has changed, to either maybe change their opinion or view their support, or react to what the latest and greatest is going on. And I know you had the September meeting. I understand that coming from a busy community, I'm sure that maybe is not enough time for those folks to now respond to the latest and greatest. The CUP, putting it through this process definitely makes things longer, and it creates complexity. And we say it can be taken to City Council for City Council to determine what they think about these drive-throughs. And what they think about these sites. Now, mind you, again, I go back to the fact that a development community has studied this, understands what's viable, what's market-driven, what's going to succeed, and that's what they're putting before City Council. That said, we're going to allow City Council to now determine that that's not going to work, or decide those features at City Council. Now that completely changes all your metrics behind the scenes of what makes a site work, and say, oh, cross this out. You can't have 5 drive-through, you can have 2. I mean, I think it's to wait that far in the game to get council approval. That just seems, I don't know. I just worry about that. And I know that there's a lot of places within here we talk about the ability, like, yes, this is our best effort, this is what we'd like to see, but there's always opportunity for deviations, waivers, variances, and all these things. I know, working behind the scenes on development communities, no developer wants, every developer, well, that I work with, that I can speak on behalf of, wants to meet every single standard. That is the #1 goal, is behind scenes, they're saying, what's the standard? Let's meet them all. It's when they can't meet them that they come before and they realize it's a cumbersome process to walk through deviations, variations. It lasts longer, it takes longer, though it's complex, it gets confusing. We don't know where the approvals come from, how high does it need to go, what department, there's multiple meetings. So that said, I know there's a process in place to deviate, to waiver, and it can make us feel good, but in reality, that does add complexity to a project, time and money too. And because there's a lot to this, I also can admit personally that I don't know the rolling impacts of this. Like, has someone laid out a site now with this 100-foot and say, how does this actually work now that the site that wants to have 3, now with these new standards, how does that lay out? I don't know that that's been thought through, and I myself haven't laid that out to think through that, what the implications are. And I can't think of every scenario that there is out there and how this rolls into it. So for me, I'm just a little bit nervous with this really, really complex. There's so many pieces and parts to this, what's being proposed. I feel like there's almost like 5 different things being proposed here that I just don't quite know how to react to them. There's things I absolutely like. I love the intention behind them. But there's other things that I get very nervous about what that means behind the scenes. And also, I know we talked about traffic impact studies, queuing analysis, and that's how I make a living. So certainly I'm a fan of those things, but there already are things in place at the City of Mesa. So TIAs are already required, and there's certain requirements. You can look at your code, and they are done. So there are circulation analysis. And I can also say, I know the intent is safety and to have a quality development. I couldn't agree more, and I don't think anyone out there proposing a certain site plan would not agree that their site plan or whatever they're proposing, their also main goals is safety and to make a quality development that folks also like. And the least, I would say, the last thing someone would want is a development that causes problems in the end. So I do understand that there are ones that do cause problems. I believe that those are trying very hard. Most of those that want to continue to stay in business are trying very hard to mediate that. And I think the popularity of certain drive-throughs, I guess as a business owner, you would hope to be popular beyond all means that you're exceeding all of your queuing, right? Now, is that creating issues? Yes. So now your next goal as a business owner, a good business owner, would be to try your best to mitigate that. But your best is your prediction, right? It's your consumer that you're trying to predict, which can change quickly too. So that said, I kind of agree that there's just a lot here that I feel a little uncomfortable just kind of passing it along and moving it along. I also don't know quite how to make a motion of saying, I accept this, except can we modify this, and this, and this. I feel like I'd be here for a while. I'd like to have dinner too. So that's my 2 cents, and I'll stop there.
Thank you for that. Board Member Peterson, please.
Yeah, thank you, Board Member Blakeman, for that. And thank you to staff truly as well for all your effort over the time for this, chasing a very elusive target, definitely with the dynamics of it, and taking us on this ride. Although it may feel a little more like the teacup ride than other rides. But so I think and I apologize for referencing my notes here a little bit. It feels like there's several false narratives that are at play here. The first one is, as has been discussed, I did read through the 89 pages of citizen support emails, and all but 3 or 4 of those were about fewer drive-through fast food restaurants, more sit-down restaurants. And it's already been discussed that this ordinance doesn't achieve that. And then the to play onto that false narrative is that Mesa doesn't have enough sit-down restaurants, and which isn't the case either. You look at, areas that, and it's all something that comes with the development cycle. Maybe in Council District 6, a newer developing area, some of those sit-down areas have yet to develop, and maybe the demand's not there, because reality is, for a lot of sit-down demand, you have to have both lunch and dinner demand, and if people are commuting from where they live and they're not frequenting those places for lunch, then the viability is not there, and that's what the market tells us based on demand that we've heard in the meeting today. But there are, you look around the city, there's the area around Superstition Mall, a lot of sit-down places there. The old Fiesta Mall, there's fewer than there were because of the dynamic changing area there. Mekong Plaza, lots of sit-down restaurants around there. Dana Park, a lot of sit-down restaurants. So the narrative that Mesa only has fast food drive-through and doesn't have these other options is just a false narrative. And then the reality is that with this ordinance, if somehow now Riverview becomes Tempe Marketplace because we have this this ordinance in place is just not the case. That's more complex issues that aren't going to be solved by a zoning ordinance. The second one is that there's these exhibits that are part of staff report that show over 20% of the city can have drive-throughs. And the reality is a lot of those areas are heavy industrial areas where it's, and you look at how a lot of those are developing, they're developing as industrial, big box industrial, whatever type of industrial areas there. There aren't a lot of drive-throughs going through in those areas, and so to change to say, okay, these areas can't have drive-throughs now, and because we without going through the CEP, then we've accomplished something when in staff's own report that over the last 2.5 years, the Delta is only 5 projects that would have to go through that didn't have to go through in the past, and that's in the margins as far as are we really stepping up here, or are we just stepping to the side? The next false narrative is on comparable to adjacent cities, and we looking at Chandler and Gilbert, the per capita per people per 100 acres, the Mesa has fewer fast food establishments than fewer drive-throughs than Gilbert, and is very comparable in a few percentage points of Chandler, and those are very comparable cities. Scottsdale, I think, is a tougher one to compare to, but it shows you that we're right there on track. The next false narrative is the current regulations leave intense drive-through uses unchecked, which isn't true. In the time that I've spent on the board, we've had Chick-fil-A's come through, we've had intense drive-through projects come through. They're being designed. That's part of the discussion. That's part of what we do. The last Chick-fil-A that came through had three drive-through lanes already designed in to what they're doing. And so to say that the current ordinance lets kind of a free-for-all is not the case either. And then so then in looking at the standards, and like Board Member Blakeman said, in trying to say, hey, are there a few tweaks we can make here that will get it to where it makes sense, or that it feels comfortable to move forward with. And so I started taking some notes and started saying, okay, this, and realized that I was proposing tweaks to almost everything in it, and it felt like a lot. And I think that goes to some of the comments that it's not quite there yet. The whole basis of why, if you're meeting this, why have a standard and require the circulation study in all cases is perplexing. The 100-foot residential buffer is arbitrary. It doesn't consider what's happening on the other side of the residential property line, and as illustrated by the figure in the text of the ordinance, having that 100-foot buffer actually creates some safety issues with pedestrians having to now park in that, where parking stalls are in the buffer, and walk across the drive-through, which is not ideal and not the best plan. And I get it, that's just an example, but it goes to show you that it's not a slam dunk. Yes, this makes a lot of sense, that there's other ways to work through those things. Per the discussion in the study session, there are still a lot of hoop jumping, waivers, questions, and details yet to be worked out. As been discussed, the city's attorney is working out language to mitigate the Prop 207 risks of passing this. And as we look through and break down the real dynamics of it, we're really in the margins from the the change from the existing ordinance, and it's not demonstrated effectively as written to justify the changes to this rather than sticking to the elements as they are. And as it's currently written, it's not something that I'm able to support.
Thank you, Board Member Peterson. Board Member Carpenter, Board Member Montez, do either of you have anything you want to weigh in with in the discussion?
I'll just say I appreciate the hard work that was put into this. I think there was a lot of thought and consideration and contemplation, and trying to walk a fine line and maintaining balance is very difficult. Obviously, there's different interests and different protections and experiences here. And, you know, a lot of what has been said, I could echo. I think the market is kind of telling us what it wants by how it's voting with its money. And looking at the presentation, you know, is interesting to see that while we do have so much more percentage of zoning area available, that we're kind of on par as far as the per capita and the per acre. That was really interesting. Let's see. I do like the the definitions and the changes there to identify the different needs and the different usages with the drive-through versus a drive-up. And I think that's a new emerging market, so to speak, here. And so I really think there's something there that can be had with that, as well as differentiating like an ATM or bank use or, say, a pharmacy use that's very low, you know, parking and whatever there. So you know, there's a lot here, and I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. Appreciate the comments. There's a lot to chew on here. So you know, that's kind of it for me, I guess.
Thank you. Anything? Okay. All right.
You want me to talk about my Googling?
No. Well, if you want to talk about your Googling, I don't want to stop you, but, okay. Well, I recognize how much work has gone into this by staff, and I sure appreciate it. And there's some things in this ordinance that I like. I totally agree in terms of the quality of the new construction that we're approving, drive-throughs that are well thought out, that are safe, that don't negatively impact adjoining neighborhoods. All of that I am for, but as I've thought through being an applicant and coming to the city to build something, there's still some things that are troubling about what's being proposed. There's just some question marks and things that would be difficult to anticipate for the development community. And I thought about whether I could even propose some amendments. Board Member Peterson talked about that, and I kind of made a half a dozen items on a list as we were in our study session, things that I would probably like to clarify and on this ordinance. And so I'm not sure I'm in a position to even offer up amendments, and I like Board Member Peterson, I'm not sure I'm quite ready to support this ordinance in the current form. So that's my thought process on it. Any other comments on this before I ask if there's a motion to be made here? Does anyone want to make a motion on this?
Can you just make a motion to continue the case?
Based on the council schedule, it sounds like that's why I asked early on if it's this is an up-down based on council schedule, and that was the answer, was it's an up-down and on to council. So that I guess that's a question for me.
Yeah, and I think the way, and we'll hear from the director here, but I think if the vote is ultimately not to support this in its current form tonight, I think it just goes to the council with a negative recommendation from this board. Is that right?
So, Chair, board members, I'm not sure we have a clear understanding of exactly what would need to change. So that's why continuing it, I'm not sure would take us where we need to go. So I'll let Charlotte talk about what that looks like if there's a motion to not move this forward.
Chair, board members, if there is a motion to not adopt the ordinance, then that would move forward to city council with that recommendation.
That's kind of what I thought. So
Can't make a recommendation, so you can take it.
I think that we could recommend, or we could have a motion to continue this, and if that motion passes, I think that puts this in a bit of a limbo. I guess it would go on to the council with a vote to continue. But by the time we heard it again, the council would have had a study session or potentially acted on it. So I think there's some huddling going on over here. We'll wait just a moment.
Yeah, just because I think that I think we all kind of pointed out some goods in here that we all really kind of like and can get behind, but we also pointed out some things that we're all feeling really uncomfortable. So it's not that we're saying we hate it altogether. It's really saying like, gosh, can we get some clarity on some things and work through a few things? And we hope to get there. We want to get behind supporting.
So there are two things, Chair and board members, if I can, and I'll address the first, and that is that the unclarity that I'm hearing, I'm not sure I understand. So it would be challenging for us to go back and do modifications because we hear from the public and from the board members that it's not ready, yet staff is presenting what they think is ready and that it is clear. And so I'll let Charlotte talk about what your next steps could be.
If I could just interject in looking through, I mean, normally it would be make a motion with okay, let's add this item or adjust this item, but there's so much, and I think we have verbalized those both in study session and here, where there's questions and there's things, and I don't think it's things that we can rewrite, an amendment to it from the dais here, that it needs to be maybe a work session, working together and talking through those things. And you can play back, you can hear our concerns in the questioning and everything that we've had discussion tonight, and all the issues that we've talked through. And so I think that's the tough one with this one. It's just not a matter of, hey, let's move to recommend adoption with these couple of amendments, because it's just a lot, and there's some that probably need some back and forth discussion. Otherwise, if we'll make it up on our end, and then it'll be something that staff will prefer to be different or something like that. So this one uniquely is tough to do that.
Chair, board members, I think you have a couple different options. You can recommend adoption. You can recommend adoption with proposed changes if you want to go that direction, or you can make a motion to not support the adoption. Don't think you have the option to continue to City Council.
Okay. I appreciate that clarification, and I think that, at least from what I'm hearing on this half of the dais, that amending it, proposing amendments at this meeting today wouldn't be a practical solution for us, because we're not ready to propose specific amendments, and it would probably involve some back and forth. And I'm not sure there's the votes to pass it, so it may just be a vote to not to approve it, perhaps with the understanding that, again, there are things that we really like about the ordinance. We think, at least I think, the ordinance can be adopted in a form that I could really get behind, but I don't think it's in that form today.
Can you also recommend, right, like not adopting it, but putting in some of the thoughts, bullet points of why?
Well, they'll have the minutes from this meeting, so
Got it,
they'll
so.
see what the discussion's been.
Yeah, so I again, I'm back to requesting a motion on this one.
I'll take a go here. Regarding item 3BPZ 23109, proposed amendments to chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, 31, 58, 86, and 87 of Title 11 zoning ordinance of the Mesa City Code pertaining to drive-through facilities, pickup window facilities, and drive-up ATM teller windows. The amendments include, but are not limited to, repealing in its entirety Section 11-31-18, drive-through facilities, and replacing it with the new Section 11-31-18, drive-through and pickup window facilities, modifying land use tables pertaining to drive-through facilities, pickup window facilities, and drive-up ATM teller windows, removing definitions of drive-through facilities and adding new definitions for drive-through facilities, pickup window facilities, and drive-up ATM teller windows. And the motion is to not recommend adoption.
Okay, you've heard the motion. Is there a second? All right.
I second the motion.
We have a second. Let's go ahead and vote on the motion. Okay, by your vote of 5 ayes, no nays, with 2 absent, you have passed the item, which is in effect to not recommend approval of the item. All right, I'll turn it back to the director.
Thank you, Chair, board members. We have no director update for this meeting.
All right, thank you. Thank you to everyone that's been here today for this. I will entertain a motion to adjourn our zoning and our zoning meeting today.
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
I second.
All in favor? All right, by your vote of 5 ayes, no noes, with 2 absent, you voted to adjourn our meeting. Thank you, everyone.